Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving straight into something pretty fascinating. How creative people, musicians, artists, how they bring intention to their work. We're exploring the power of having frameworks, the kind of surprisingly creative role of lists, and the strategic approach of working in series.
We've looked at a really interesting collection of writings, artists reflecting on making music, creating visual art, and just the broader patterns of the creative process itself. Our goal today is pretty simple: to understand how these deliberate structures, these frameworks, lists, and this idea of working in a sequence, a series, actually fuel and sustain creativity over time.
One of the first things that really stood out is this idea of constraints. Now, in the past, especially with music, limitations often came from, well, the physical format, the length of an LP side, for instance.
Right, the physical limits.
But what's really interesting is how those constraints have changed.
Yeah, and what's compelling is that even though media formats have completely transformed, the need for some kind of constraint hasn't disappeared. As our sources highlight, these constraints now operate more in the realm of, well, human attention. Think about it. There used to be this almost unspoken rule in music to introduce a new section or idea around the 2 to 2.5 minute mark, especially in more, repetitive pieces. And one of our sources points out that just a decade later, that time frame has often shrunk to just 1 to 1.5 minutes, sometimes even less.
It's all about grabbing and holding our focus. And this leads to a really insightful idea that came up, the metaphor of the package.
A packet.
It's not just about how the music or art is presented, but how that presentation subtly guides our behavior and, crucially, our attention.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows us how even seemingly unbound creative fields are constantly navigating boundaries, even if those boundaries are now more about psychology than, say, physical limitations. And this naturally leads us to the idea of having deliberate starting points for creative work.
Which brings us to frameworks and concepts. This approach really resonated with me, the idea of not always needing a completely blank canvas.
Yeah, ditch the blank page terror.
Exactly. One of our sources describes their preferred way to be productive as working on existing ideas, but always staying open to those unexpected happy accidents and, noting them down for later use.
What's insightful here is that balance between intention and chance. It's not about rigidly sticking to a plan, but about having a solid foundation to build upon while also being receptive to, surprising possibilities.
Right.
And this idea extends to having specific composition strategies.
Apparently, some musicians keep ongoing lists of these strategies, some going back decades.
Wow.
Some have even turned them into actual decks of cards, physical and digital, with subsets for specific genres or even musical keys. There's even a link we saw to a whole library of these strategy cards.
Strategy cards, I love that.
It makes you think about how having these predefined approaches can actually spark creativity rather than limit it.
That raises a really interesting question. How can having a structured approach actually lead to more freedom? And the answer lies in part in the idea of cycles and symmetries.
Okay, cycles and symmetries.
Our sources discuss these repeating patterns in harmony, rhythm, melody as being like the underlying structure, the skeleton really, of a musical piece or improvisation.
Like a blueprint.
Kind of. Think of it like the recurring patterns in a good story, a setup, rising action, climax, falling action. These underlying structures provide a familiar and, pleasing framework. These cycles, often based on divisions of 12 in Western music, provide that kind of foundational framework.
It's almost like having a set of rules that then give you the freedom to play within them. And that reminds me of the idea of working in series, which is another key strategy we came across.
Serialization. Yes. As our sources explain, this is this conscious creative strategy of working in a connected sequence across different art forms.
Right.
The thought experiment about iconic albums like Sgt. Pepper or Dark Side of the Moon potentially being serialized if they were made today, that really makes you consider how our consumption habits and creative outputs might be shifting.
Right. Instead of one definitive monumental album, maybe we'd see a series of interconnected releases.
Exactly.
And it makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider conceptual work, because often the underlying themes or subject matter are timeless and constantly evolving, much like life itself.
Which our sources point out, life is a continuous flow, making serialization a really natural approach.
It fits. And speaking of that continuous flow and ideas generating more ideas, let's talk about lists. It might seem really simple, but the act of keeping lists is highlighted as incredibly important for creative individuals.
More than just to-dos.
Definitely. It's not just about remembering things, it's about the generative power of these lists, the process of cultivating and pruning. We often think of lists as just a way to organize tasks, but Umberto Eco's perspective is fascinating. The list doesn't destroy culture, it creates it. When you think about it, so much of our cultural knowledge is presented in list form, from lists of ancient rulers to constellations to even, recommended reading.
What's insightful here is how these seemingly unrelated items, when placed together in a list, can spark new connections and ideas in your mind. And on a more personal level, one of our sources shares a really relatable anecdote about keeping logs of completed musical pieces and assigning them numbers
Oh yeah, the numbering thing.
as a simple but effective way to maintain motivation.
That's such a great idea. That sense of progress and accomplishment just by adding to the list. And it's not just for music. Our sources mention lists for visual art series, a book of concise observations called Dynaxiom, lists of potential titles, lines for lyrics.
Just general sparks of ideas.
Exactly. These become a rich source of potential starting points.
And speaking of Dynaxiom, there are some really insightful points within it about lists themselves. For instance, the idea that simply keeping a list increases the likelihood of completion and acts as a form of motivation, even if you don't immediately act on those items.
That's having it written down.
Yeah. Or the notion that fundamental musical elements like scales, chords, and melodies can be seen as selections from a pre-existing list of possibilities.
And I really appreciated the Dynaxiom that said innovation needs implementation, not just discussion. It's a good reminder that the list itself isn't the final goal. It's a tool to drive action. And another key idea was that creating frameworks is more rewarding if they can be used by others, if they have that ability to generate new ideas for other people.
That really speaks to the collaborative and evolving nature of creativity.
Yeah, sharing the tools.
And the final dynaxiom related to lists that stood out was how cohesion can be added to creative work, either by creating first and then grouping it into a series, or by intentionally creating within an already established series a concept that's directly applicable to putting together, say, a cohesive music album.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Now, taking the idea of lists a step further, we get into the concept of grids.
Like grids, okay.
This isn't just about physical grids like graph paper, but also the idea of a grid in the head, a structured way of approaching creative work, almost like working architecturally in music production to ensure you have a complete and sound structure.
Like a mental scaffold.
Exactly. So for someone organizing a complex project, this grid could be a mental checklist of key milestones, ensuring each crucial element is addressed systematically.
Our sources highlight Chuck Close's use of grids in his paintings as a perfect illustration. The grid becomes a heuristic, essentially a list of squares to systematically fill, providing a clear and manageable path forward. And this is beautifully connected to the idea of musical orchestration,
How so?
where a composer methodically places notes onto the grid of musical staves. It's structured, step by step.
It's like breaking down a large, potentially overwhelming task into smaller, manageable steps within a predefined structure. And the strategy of working on something else when you're feeling stuck, whether it's designing the album art, brainstorming titles, or tackling a technical aspect that's like moving to a different item on your mental list of tasks to maintain momentum and avoid getting completely blocked.
That really resonates with Jerry Saltz's advice to always leave something to do tomorrow.
Oh, well, they
A way to ensure you have a point of reentry, a way to easily restart that mental list.
keeps the engine running.
Yeah. And the examples of city grids, like Chicago's very structured layout, or artworks like the Beeple piece, which is essentially a chronological grid of images created day by day, really illustrate how this concept of structured lists can manifest in very different forms.
So we've explored constraints, frameworks, lists, and grids. But how do these structures actually help with problem solving and adapting to change in the creative process?
This is where the idea of serialization as a tool for problem solving becomes really interesting. By working within a series, you start to identify recurring elements and patterns across the individual pieces. This can actually streamline your decision making and help you resolve recurring challenges. If you commit to creating, say, 12 pieces within a specific series, you're naturally pushed to find those unifying threads and address any consistent issues that arise.
So the series itself helps you figure things out.
In a way, yes. And the frameworks, or those grids we've been talking about, act as containers for creative work. Think of a concept album as a framework for a collection of songs.
Right, the container idea.
But crucially, our sources emphasize that these frameworks aren't meant to be rigid, They should be adaptable. If a new idea emerges, one of those happy accidents we mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
you can adjust the framework to incorporate it.
That flexibility is absolutely key.
Definitely. And while metaphors can be incredibly powerful tools in creative problem solving, it's important to be mindful not to take them too literally, as they might unintentionally create new problems or, distort the original meaning too much. It's about finding that sweet spot and being aware of the potential influence of the metaphors we use.
Now, creative thinking often isn't a straight line. We jump between ideas, make unexpected connections. So how does this nonlinearity fit into the idea of working in series?
Our sources acknowledge that creative thinking is often nonlinear. No argument there.
Yeah.
However, serialization can still provide a sense of cohesion to this type of work by connecting the finished pieces back to an existing series. Even if the individual works seem quite different, the fact that they belong to the same series establishes a unifying link.
Ah, okay. So the series label itself provides structure.
Exactly. And something as simple as the titles you give to the works can act as punctuation marks, helping to connect these seemingly disparate explorations. The main takeaway here seems to be that rigidly sticking to traditional genre expectations isn't as important as that underlying connection to the larger series you're building.
It's more about the artist's internal logic.
Exactly. It's more about the artists establishing their own internal logic and connections within the series. And this leads us to a really interesting discussion about originality and imitation in art.
This was fascinating. There are different shades of imitation, right? Ranging from simply being inspired by something to directly engaging with or even like subverting an existing work
Right.
to even revisiting and building upon your own successful ideas. It made me think about artists like David Bowie, who is constantly reinventing himself, versus someone like Brian Eno, who has explored repetition and variation within his own established soundscapes. And then you have artists like Peter Halley or Richard Serra, who create extensive variations within a very consistent series over long periods.
What's really insightful is the idea that true creativity often lies in the underlying concepts and philosophies driving the work, even in pieces that might seem imitative on the surface.
The why behind it.
Exactly. The fact that a creative process can be generative, meaning that once a core approach is developed, many more works can be created from the same foundational elements without needing to completely reinvent the wheel each time. That's a really powerful aspect of working in series.
Like a good recipe.
Think of it like a recipe exactly. Once you have a good basic recipe, you can create countless variations by changing just a few ingredients. The core process is generative.
It's like you've discovered a language, and now you can use it to tell many different stories. And this brings us to the idea of the creativity machine and the crucial role of intentionality.
Right. A recent study suggests that releasing more music can actually increase recognition for artists, regardless of whether they have a very distinct signature style or are more eclectic in their output. But our sources rightly caution that the underlying intention behind the work is absolutely paramount. Are you creating primarily for the intrinsic joy of the process, or are you mainly driven by the desire for external validation, for social media likes and attention? The cooking metaphor that came up really brought this home. If you're cooking for a dinner party, but your underlying intention is to manipulate your guests in some way, that intention can taint the entire process. Similarly, if creative work is solely driven by the need for external attention, it can lose its genuine spark.
Definitely feels less authentic.
And this circles back to how serialization can be a potential way to manage creative output, especially in fields like visual art where physical objects accumulate. Working in series can provide a framework for managing production. One of our sources even mentioned a personal shift towards focusing on music precisely because it avoids the accumulation of more physical objects.
It's interesting. It's about filling that blank page or canvas with something that has a structural connection to a larger body of work, driven by that internal motivation rather than simply manufacturing content for the sake of it. But the crucial caution here is not to get too fixated on numbers and metrics. The main focus should remain on the self-created system and the overall quality and coherence of the body of work you're building.
What series are you currently a part of in your professional life, your ongoing learning, your personal growth? And how might consciously applying some of these structural principles we've discussed today unlock new avenues for exploration and deeper understanding? What lists or frameworks could you create right now to further your own insights and development in those areas?